we're going to look at the basic fretboard measurements. We've established that this is up, this is down, and if we look at the musical alphabet, in fact the A string is the perfect place. We can see the labels. It goes A, B, C. The labels are just labels for the pitch, for the sound. That's all it is. Now, there is a pattern that progresses through this, but as you can see, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then we go back to A again. You could even look at that as being like a clock, A, B, C, D, E, or a circle. So that goes back around here. We have to look at the units of measurement, because I kind of think of the fretboard as being like a pitch ruler, you know, with each one being, you could have centimeters and inches, but really the smallest one we have is 1 fret, yeah, which is called a half step. Now, I know you're thinking, oh, Ricky, I already know this, but look, it's good to go through this just to clarify it, because the more clear something is in your mind, the more readily you are going to be able to use it. So we've got 1 fret, and that's a half step. Now, we naturally have 2 spots where that happens, between the B and the C and the E and the F. And when we get that, between that B and the C, I just use this little mnemonic. It's how I like my breakfast. I like my bacon crispy, and I like my eggs fried. So that's for the half step, right? So if you look, you can see that the distance between that E and that F there, look, you can see we get that half step. And you can see here, between the B and the C. Now, if we go up 2 frets, what that does is it gives us a step. And when we get the step, we don't need to remember anything. What we could do is we can use this little bracket symbol there. I like to use an angle bracket for the half steps and a staple bracket for the whole steps. So you can see there, so 2 frets, step, and then 1 fret is a half step. And that's what we're going to look at, these structures about chunks. And this is what we're doing. We're going to do this chunking thing. I've talked about this before. If you think about your mobile phone number, if somebody was to say, oh, what's your number? Instead of saying it as one long stream, we would chunk it up. We would slice it up so that we can memorize it. That's what we want to do. Right, so we're going to split the A, B, C, D, E, F into 3 chunks. I know it isn't hard to remember A, B, C, D, E, F, G like this, but once you start to move it around the guitar neck, it can become tricky. Now, I need to plot this out for you so that you can see. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little table here, and I'm going to put these letters in here. So we get A, B, and C. And you can see here what we've got is we've got bacon crispy already. So we've got bacon crispy. Now, what we need to do is we need that whole step just in between the A and the B. So you can see we've got a whole step, and then we get a half step. So we can see how that works now. I'm going to get some colour and I'm going to apply it to the fretboard here. You're going to see that this pattern is reliable. It's always going to be there. Okay, so we've got A, B, C. There, can you see that one? On the A string. I did it on the A string because it's the most obvious string to do it on. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to the E string here, and I'm going to do it on this E string. Anything that happens on this E string, it's going to happen and be mirrored on this E string as well. So let me just wallop that over there. I've got a couple of ways I can get to this actually, and I'll just talk you through it in my thinking process. I don't want to be counting up here, but I already know that it's there because when I learnt it, I got my BDI in on the 7th fret here. A, B, C. We've got the A, B, C just there as well. And then if I come up here, you can see I've got A, B, C here. I could also think to myself, well, that's an A, and I know that my A-shaped octave is over that way as well. So I could think of it in that manner. And then I know that this one is all the way up here, and that gets me into that spot there. Now that's B, C, so that's rolling over from there to there. Now you could, this is a way as well. Somebody showed me this once, and it was interesting. I thought, oh yeah, that's really cool. That if you think of the fretboard as being a cylinder, if you join up the 0th fret and the 12th fret together, yeah, and just put it like that, it's a cylinder. So you see how that A and B and C are rolling over onto that one there. Does that make sense? That's what we've got there. And you can see that it's got this gap. There is something in the gap there, but we don't need to know that yet. We'll come back to that. Now, we've got A, B, C, and then we've got D, E, and F. I want you to see this. It's a visual thing. The next chunk, the D, E, F, well, look, we get the half step and then we get the step just here. So look at the A, B, C and look at the D, E, F, and you can see they have the same pattern. They are exactly the same pattern. And then you'll start to see that when I put it on the fretboard. So if I start here on this A string, because I went A, B, C, D, E, F. I'll put it on the D string from the open D string. Look at that there. Now if I come over here, D, E, F, because I've done it on this thin E string, I'm going to have to do it on the thick E string because that mirrors as well. We've got this recurring pattern that starts to happen. Now I've got the D-shaped octave going into the C-shaped octave, into the A-shaped octave, into the G-shaped octave, into the E-shaped octave. So you can see how that is rolling around. But the interesting thing is you get these little patterns here. That lovely little rectangle there with 6 notes, right? Now 6 notes. I'm going to come back to this in a minute because when I talk about scales, it's going to make a lot of sense. Obviously, something is happening here. Whereas these, you can see that this pattern that we have that replicated itself, they're parallel to each other on these strings. And that's because of the tuning, in fourths. You see here that notes are parallel to each other. But if we look here, we can see it goes wonky, doesn't it? So it gets a bit wonky there. We've always got to be mindful of the tuning between the G and the B string, and we have to compensate and add 1 fret for the next string up. When we move up one, you would think to yourself A, B, C, D, E, F, but no, we've got to compensate. And then what happens is it writes itself again, and you can see that it's righted itself again. If we come to the bottom down here, you can see we're back to that nice 3 fret pattern. If you look at this one, coming back up here, you can see that this spans 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 frets. That takes up 5 frets, whereas this takes up 4 frets. Okay, so just be mindful of that crossover from the G to the B string. I missed off my E and the F there. Okay, so we've got 1 left. We have a lonely G. Now I just like to say this G here is a gangster with no crew. So there is the lonely G, the G on its own. So we isolate the G there. And what I can do is I can tie this into my caged octaves. Look, so there's the G-shaped octave, there's the A-shaped octave, there's the D-shaped octave, moving over into the C-shaped octave, into the A-shaped octave. Now, to notice with this is as well, is in between each of these chunks, we always get a step. So we always get a step in between them. In fact, in between the G, and you can see it here, we can see we've got E and F, then we've got the gap, and you can see we get the G. So the G is all on its own there. And then from the G to the A, we get a gap, and then we get to the A there. So we get that step in between. So there is always going to be a step in between each of the chunks, okay? So you can see how that G jumps onto the A, B, C. But let me put this on the fretboard.